In every Jamaican classroom, the lesson is the same. The Taíno vanished, wiped out within decades of Columbus. A DNA test just said otherwise. And that motto on the wall behind every teacher, "Out of many, one people," was written as if they never made it onto the list at all. In 2003, a geneticist in Puerto Rico tested nearly 800 families and found that most of them still carried Taíno DNA, passed down mother to child, unbroken for 500 years. In 2020, scientists sequenced 174 genomes from people who died before Columbus ever landed, and the maternal line matched exactly. The people's Spanish records, reduced to almost nothing on paper, were never gone. And on the anglophone islands, the ones taught the Taíno story ended completely. Nobody has said this out loud until now. This is the DNA those schools never mentioned, and the record that tried to close the file on them in 1565. Picture a Jamaican classroom, a map of the island on one wall, the national motto painted across the other. Out of many, one people. Say it out loud and it sounds like an invitation. A list of everyone who built the island. West African communities brought over in chains, British colonists, Chinese laborers who arrived after emancipation, Indian indentured workers, a small, long-standing Sephardic Jewish community that traces back centuries. Jamaican schoolchildren learn this list early, usually before they learn much else about their own history. What they also learn in the same lessons is that the list starts after the Taíno, not with them. The textbook version is specific. The people living on the island when Columbus arrived in 1494 did not survive contact. They were gone within a single generation, the textbook says, and whatever mixing produced modern Jamaica happened entirely among the groups that came afterward. That is the story taught in classrooms across the anglophone Caribbean, not just Jamaica. It is presented as settled history, not as one interpretation among several. Even though a genetic test doesn't settle history, it just reads DNA. And when researchers went looking for what that DNA contained, in Puerto Rico first and then across the wider Caribbean, what they found did not match the classroom version. It did not come close. And once you see how far off it was, that painted motto on the wall starts to look less like a full list and more like an unfinished one. The gap between the two versions is not a rounding error, and it is not an academic footnote either. It is the difference between a national origin story with 5 threads and one with 6. And the 6th thread was not lost to history in the way the classroom implies. It was lost to a specific piece of paperwork, written more than 400 years before any Jamaican schoolbook existed, on an island that is not even Jamaica. To understand why a DNA test taken in Kingston or Montego Bay today comes back with an answer no textbook prepared anyone for, you have to start with that paperwork in Puerto Rico in the year 1565. In 1565, Spanish colonial administrators in Puerto Rico produced a set of records that counted the surviving indigenous population there and found it reduced to almost nothing, a fraction of what it had been at contact 7 decades earlier. That record mattered for a clear legal reason. Under Spanish colonial law, a recognized indigenous population still held certain land claims, however limited. A population the administration could describe as effectively gone did not. The count did more than document a demographic collapse. It resolved an administrative problem. Land that Taíno families still had some legal standing to hold could be reassigned once that standing was written out of the record. This is worth being precise about, because the popular version of this story often compresses it into a single sweeping Caribbean-wide decree wiping the Taíno off the legal map in one stroke. That is not quite what the historical record supports. What the record supports is narrower and, in a way, more damning. Local administrative paperwork, serving a narrow land title purpose, recorded a population as functionally finished. The women who were still alive, who were still having children, who were still passing down their mother's ancestry to those children, did not stop existing because a census column stopped naming them. They were reclassified into a broader mixed heritage category. The people did not disappear. The category did. The same logic shows up elsewhere in the colonial record. In several documented cases, Spanish colonists married the daughters of surviving caciques, the Taíno regional chiefs, specifically to gain legal claim to land the cacique's family already held. The marriage secured the property on paper, and the children of it grew up in households colonial society recorded as Spanish, carrying Taíno ancestry into families it would classify by any label except Taíno. The legal identity changed twice over, once by census and once by marriage. The biological reality underneath it did not move at all. To see how far that reality traveled, you have to go back much further than 1565, to the scale of the population that got reclassified in the first place, which is not what most retellings of this story assume. The Taíno did not originate in the Caribbean, and they were not a small population when Europeans arrived. Research traces their ancestors to the Orinoco and Amazon basin region of present-day Venezuela and Colombia, where communities paddled open ocean canoes northward through the islands roughly 8,000 years ago, in organized waves rather than one accidental crossing, generation after generation launching into open water toward islands they couldn't yet see, navigating by current and star the way a sailor today reads a chart. The Taíno were the last, and by far the largest, of those waves. Archaeologists can trace the migration with unusual precision through a distinctive pottery style, the Saladoid tradition, which appears island by island in a datable sequence, essentially an 8,000-year-old migration mapped out in broken clay. By 1492, the Taíno had an agricultural economy, a political system of regional chiefs called caciques, and a population historians estimate at somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people across Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. Several everyday English words, hurricane among them, entered the language directly from Taíno, still spoken today by people who have no idea where the word came from. A 2020 genetic study sequenced 174 complete genomes from pre-contact individuals at Caribbean archaeological sites, all radiocarbon dated to before European contact, and the maternal signatures in those ancient genomes set the baseline against which every modern claim of Taíno descent would eventually be measured. By the time Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, this was not a fading population at the edge of someone else's story. It was a 2,000-year-old civilization spread across 5 island groups, with its own agriculture, its own political structure, and a language embedded deeply enough that people still speak pieces of it today without knowing where the words came from. That is the population the 1565 land records reduced to a column in a census, and the distance between that scale and the wiped out within a generation version taught in Jamaican classrooms is the distance the next part of this story has to cross, because something did happen to it over roughly 2 decades after 1492, fast enough that the paperwork could plausibly claim the people were finished, and specific enough that the mechanism behind it has a name of its own. What produced that collapse had a name: the encomienda, a Spanish colonial labor system that assigned whole Taíno communities to individual colonizers as forced labor, mostly in gold mining and agriculture. In theory, the colonizer owed the laborers basic provisions in return. In practice, it was built to extract maximum output from a population Spanish colonial law classified as inferior, with minimal rest and no real limit on how hard the work could run. Researchers studying the surviving mortality records now estimate death rates of somewhere between 60 and 80% within about 5 years of assignment, driven by exhaustion, introduced disease, and outright violence. That's a hard number to sit with. Somewhere between 6 and 8 out of every 10 people forced into that system did not survive 5 years of it. If a stat like that changes how you read the rest of this island's history, say so in the comments. It's worth naming out loud, not scrolling past. This story isn't finished yet either, and if you want to see exactly where it goes next, staying subscribed is how you catch it. The Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, the system's most prominent contemporary critic, documented whole villages that emptied out within months of assignment to mining or pearl diving operations, and the surviving mortality records line up closely with what he wrote. The damage fell hardest and fastest on Taíno men, worked to death in mining operations at rates that made replacing the population through ordinary birth rates mathematically impossible within a single generation. Spain's answer to the resulting labor shortage was to begin importing enslaved West Africans, which is a separate story with its own genetic signature, still visible in Caribbean DNA today as a 3-way admixture of indigenous, European, and African ancestry. But the Taíno maternal line was already surviving through a different channel entirely, one the encomienda system could not touch no matter how many men it killed, because mitochondrial DNA does not pass through fathers at all. It passes from mother to child, generation after generation, regardless of who the father is or what happens to him. That single fact of biology is the reason the story the paperwork told and the story the genome was recording never lined up, even while both were technically describing the same population at the same time. In October 2003, a geneticist at the University of Puerto Rico named Juan Carlos Martinez Cruzado published the results of a study he had spent 4 years building. He had collected mitochondrial DNA samples from nearly 800 Puerto Rican families, a sample large enough to be statistically solid, and tested for the specific maternal signatures documented in pre-contact Taíno remains. The result, when it came back from the lab, roughly 61% of the modern Puerto Ricans in his sample carried indigenous maternal DNA, tracing back to the same population the 1565 land records had written off. Not a marginal trace, and not a rounding error buried in a footnote, a flat-out majority. In Puerto Rico and in the Dominican Republic next door, this did not land as a shock in the way it might elsewhere. Both islands' school systems already taught a mixed heritage national identity that included indigenous ancestry as one of several acknowledged threads, right alongside Spanish and West African in the same textbooks students had been reading for years. The DNA result confirmed something students there had already been taught, in different words, for years. It sharpened a known picture instead of replacing one. That distinction matters because it is the exact point where Jamaica's story splits off from Puerto Rico's, and it is worth sitting with before moving on to why. The same maternal DNA running through 2 entirely different classrooms, only one of which had been telling students the truth about it. Martinez Cruzado's 61% figure changed the public conversation in Puerto Rico anyway, because a number that large moves a known fact from the abstract into the personal. It's one thing to be taught your island's population is mixed in general terms, another to take a test and get a specific percentage back. But his study was still a snapshot of living people in 2003, 5 centuries removed from contact. It could show the maternal DNA was there, but not where it had come from. Those maternal lines could just as easily have traced to a different indigenous group that arrived after 1492, rather than descending directly from the population supposedly reduced to nothing decades earlier. Answering that meant comparing living DNA against DNA from people who died before Columbus arrived, which meant sequencing genomes already 500 years in the ground. Here is where the story stops being a Puerto Rico story. The 2020 ancient-genome study did not just confirm continuity for Puerto Rico. Researchers checked those same pre-contact maternal signatures against living populations from across the wider Caribbean, including the anglophone islands, Jamaica, Dominica, Trinidad. The match held there too. And this is the part almost nobody covering this subject has said on camera before. In Jamaica, the national origin story was never built to include this thread at all. Out of many, one people has room for Seaforth Town's German settlers, for Chinese Jamaican families who arrived after emancipation, for Indian indentured laborers, for a Sephardic Jewish community numbering in the hundreds. Jamaican classrooms make space for all of them. The one population left off the wall entirely is the one the classroom was told had nothing left to include. If that gap between what you were taught and what the genome recorded matches your own family's story, or something from school you're now looking at differently, drop it below. And if you know someone from an anglophone Caribbean background taught the exact version Jamaica teaches, send them this before you keep watching, because this is the first time most of them will have heard it stated plainly. Put another way, a Puerto Rican student taking that DNA test in 2003 was checking a box they already expected to check. A Jamaican student taking the same test today is being told something their own national curriculum told them was not there to find. That is the difference between a confirmation and a correction, and it is the reason this result on this island has stayed unspoken for as long as it has. Nobody built a national myth on Puerto Rico's mixed heritage falling apart. Somebody would have to rebuild part of Jamaica's. This is not unique to Jamaica within the Anglophone Caribbean either. Dominica and Trinidad carry the same pattern. National histories that acknowledge African, European, and in Trinidad's case, South Asian ancestry in detail, while filing indigenous ancestry away as unchanging rather than an ongoing genetic fact. The DNA data doesn't care how any island's curriculum was written. It only tells you what's actually in the sample. What differs from island to island is which classrooms got an accurate account of it, versus which ones inherited a version drafted to resolve a 500-year-old land dispute rather than to describe a population. The 2020 study that made this possible sequenced 174 complete genomes from people who died before European contact, recovered from archaeological sites across Cuba, the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola, every one of them radiocarbon dated to before 1492. When researchers compared the maternal haplogroups in those ancient genomes against the haplogroups Martinez Cruzado had identified in living Puerto Rican families 17 years earlier, the match was direct, not approximate. That resolved the open question from the previous study. The indigenous ancestry showing up in modern Caribbean populations does not trace to some other indigenous group that arrived after 1492 and mixed in later. It traces to the Taíno themselves, carried forward through maternal lines that survived the encomienda, survived the 1565 land records, and survived 4 centuries of a colonial administrative system that had already written them off. A separate 2018 ancient DNA study of Caribbean indigenous origins, led by researchers including Hannes Schroeder and Eska Willerslev, reached a broadly compatible independent conclusion, working from a completely different set of ancient samples pulled from different sites years apart. 2 separate teams, 2 separate data sets, the same answer. There is also a geographic pattern in the data worth naming. In Puerto Rico, the highest indigenous ancestry percentages show up in mountain communities in the island's interior, the areas that were hardest for Spanish colonial administration to fully reach and control. The places furthest from the colonial system's functional authority, the steep, hard-to-farm interior no Spanish administrator wanted to hike into, are the places where the maternal line survived most intact, which is not a coincidence so much as the fingerprint of geography doing what 4 centuries of paperwork could not. The percentages found across the anglophone islands are not identical to Puerto Rico's, and they should not be inflated to sound like they are. In Jamaica, Dominica, Trinidad, and other anglophone Caribbean populations, the indigenous maternal component researchers have identified is typically smaller, usually somewhere in the range of a few percent up to around 30, depending on the study and the specific community sampled, layered underneath the West African, European, and later South Asian and East Asian ancestry that dominates the region's genetic profile and its national mythology. Small is not the same as absent, and a few percent of a population base numbering in the millions is still a very large number of actual living people. What the 2020 and 2018 studies together established is that this smaller anglophone island signal is the same maternal line, not statistical noise or a post-contact fluke, verified against the same pre-contact ancient genomes that Puerto Rico's schools had already made room for and Jamaica's had not. The genetic evidence has already reached beyond the research papers. The United Confederation of Taíno People now holds recognized non-governmental status with the United Nations and organizes people across Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and diaspora communities in the continental United States who identify as Taíno descendants. The DNA results gave that reclamation movement something no purely historical argument, however well documented, could offer on its own, a biological record that does not depend on anyone's interpretation of a colonial document. But the genome answers one question and opens another one it cannot answer by itself. What is the relationship between genetic descent and cultural identity when the language associated with that ancestry has been gone for centuries, when the original belief systems were replaced under colonial pressure, when the material culture was largely destroyed and the oral traditions broken along the way? A DNA test can confirm with the same precision it used to overturn a 500-year-old assumption that the maternal line survived. It cannot hand back what was lost around it, and it does not settle what descendants owe to that history now, or what a school curriculum should do differently going forward, and whether a national motto that already names 5 peoples has room, eventually, to name a 6th. None of that is a question a laboratory can settle. If you're carrying that result yourself, or you know someone who is, that's its own conversation worth having below. But the bigger question belongs to whoever eventually decides what the next generation of Jamaican students gets taught in that same classroom, with the same national motto still hanging on the wall behind them. Those are the harder questions, the ones without a clean lab result attached, and they are only questions anyone in the Anglophone Caribbean gets to ask once the first one has actually been answered. For a long time, the paperwork closed that file in 1565, and the classrooms on this side of the Caribbean never reopened it. The genome kept the record anyway, for 460 years, whether the curriculum acknowledged it or not. It is a story about which islands got told the truth in school, and which one is only getting told the truth now, on camera, for the first time, which means every person watching this in Jamaica just became one of the first people their own country ever told.